Constitutional interpretation is not subjective at all, it is said, but can easily and objectively be discerned from the document itself. As Justice Scalia said in a 1996 speech, I take the words as they were promulgated to the people of the United States and what is the fairly understood meaning of those words. Well, fairly understood meaning seems to be a benign enough phrase and easily understood, but it's actually rather eelish. The Constitution, as every justice knows, is notoriously and sometimes deliberately vague. For example, in Article 1, Section 8, which grants explicit powers to Congress, the final clause reads, to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. This is a very potent sentence and very wide-ranging, and it was inserted midway through the Constitutional Convention by the Committee of Detail, which was chaired by a South Carolina slaveholder named John Rutledge. The Committee of Detail, by the way, which I discussed in depth in a previous book, Dark Bargain, little plug, were 5 men meeting in secret, charged with drafting a prototype constitution. Now, anyone who has ever been in business or in a law firm understands the enormous power that committees of this sort wield. Whatever they produce sets the agenda, sets the boundaries for debate. Anything included in the prototype takes a concerted effort to remove, and something not in the prototype has little chance of adoption, particularly in this case in Philadelphia, by a group of delegates who had been for 2.5 months in 90-degree weather. The State House was closed, the windows were barred, the doors were barred. They were in this small room. Many of them wore heavy clothes. It smelled, and by August, when the Committee of Detail's report came out, a lot of these people had really begun to dislike each other. In any event, Article 1, Section 8 is sometimes called the sweeping clause, and it was left intentionally amorphous by Rutledge and his 4 fellows, all of whom were Federalists. So the Federalist Party, which was going to be in power, could enact whatever legislation was required to effectively run the country. How, then, can there possibly be a fairly understood meaning, a quantifiable meaning of necessary and proper, a phrase which was inserted into the Constitution to have no quantifiable meaning? Now, as many of you know, this is no sterile argument. The necessary and proper clause is at the center of many of the challenges currently to the health care law. You're doing wonderfully, thank you. And nonetheless, and although history, to say nothing of common sense, has demonstrated time and time again that there is no one immutable interpretation of the Constitution, the current crop of value-free scholars and justices have succeeded in not only setting the tone of jurisprudence, but also enabling conservative congressmen, a number of rabid talk show hosts, and spawning a Tea Party movement privy, it insists, to the document's true meaning. So as a result, any justice who openly admits basing a decision on analysis, or even worse, applies a broad notion of fundamental justice, is derided as an activist, which today has taken on a meaning that is just this side of communist. But who is really the activist? The justice who admits that language itself is a good deal more subjective than the chemical makeup of an amino acid, or one who insists that he or she can indisputably say what an imprecise phrase means? I find this move to certainty, and I find it to be often smug certainty, to be extremely unsettling. And the stakes I consider to be very high. To get a sense of what happens when objectivity, to use Judge Bork's phrase, runs riot, we need only look back a little bit of history. And so, by a happy coincidence, we come to my book. A little scene setting is necessary. As you all know, in the wake of the Civil War, the nation enacted 3 constitutional amendments. The 13th abolished slavery, The 14th guaranteed all American citizens, everyone born in the country, regardless of color, due process of law and equal protection of the laws. And the 15th guaranteed that the right to vote would not be infringed. Now, despite the speed with which these amendments were adopted, they were not particularly popular. White Americans in the North as well as the South were none too keen at sharing sovereignty with 4 million newly freed slaves. Allowing African Americans to vote, in particular, was not even favored by the radical Republicans who controlled Congress. Now, radical Republicans is not my phrase, that's what they're called in the history books. And these radical Republicans, by the way, were not like today's version. These radical Republicans wanted to expand the role of government, expand it significantly, and use its force to guarantee full equality under law, which they believed to be a national moral imperative. So, as I said, even these men were not certain about granting the vote to a population of largely illiterate, socially unsophisticated former slaves. But a constitutional quirk made it necessary. As you all know, in the original Constitution, 3/5 of the slaves were counted for apportionment. Well, after the 13th Amendment, there were no more slaves. So these 4 million black Americans would now be counted in full to apportion Congress. And if only whites could vote in the South, which actually occurred in the 1890s, and the 11 Confederate states were allowed back into the Union, which everyone assumed they would be, and there was some substantial question as to whether or not they had ever really left, there would be more congressmen in the South by virtue of this additional 2/5 of the black population being counted. White Southerners, in other words, would be granted a larger voice in Congress and in the Electoral College by virtue of losing the war. So in the years afterwards, the nation's electorate expanded by about 2 million new potential voters. 2 million, not 4 million, because only males could vote. The amendments did not apply to women. Female suffrage was not even a glimmer yet. Now, since putting something on paper is hardly the same as making it a reality, to give teeth to these amendments, Congress passed a series of laws. They passed a Civil Rights Act of 1866, which gave all Americans, regardless of color, a right to enter into contracts, among other things, 2 Reconstruction Acts, and 3 Enforcement Acts. These laws both codified the guarantees in the 3 amendments and also established 5 military districts in the South. 11 Confederate states, Tennessee had rejoined the Union by ratifying the 14th Amendment, so they divided into the South into 5 military districts, each controlled by a general, and sent the army in to these districts to make sure that the law was adhered to. Now, as a result, there were some stunning changes in the South, not the least of which was a burgeoning of both black voters and black office holders. Many black office holders on the local level, some on the state level, and some even on the national level. There was a time when both of Mississippi's senators were African American. On the other hand, resentment of the occupation by most whites was ferocious and resulted in a concerted effort, which was both legal, supporting the Democratic Party, which opposed many of these measures, and illegal, the creation of a number of terrorist groups, the Ku Klux Klan and a number of others, to thwart the occupiers' aims. Now, to get a sense of what it's like when an occupying army moves into a defeated country with a resentful population and attempts to impose its own ideas of democracy on that population, and take people who are out of power and put them in power, and take the people who are in power and kick them out of power, think Iraq. Now, the Supreme Court is charged with enforcing these amendments, or at least ensuring they weren't end run. But the court had been buffeted about by a good deal of political pressure. Radical Republicans had made it more or less clear that adverse rulings say that the Reconstruction Acts were not constitutional, which they well might not have been, or that paper money, which had been issued during the war, was not constitutional, which it may not have been, would have been met with the most severe consequences up to and including impeachment. The justices danced around the issue. They denied jurisdiction in some cases. They dallied. They waffled. And in some cases, they just plain gave in. But by the 1870s, the taste for Reconstruction had begun to ebb considerably. And in 1875, things really began to heat up. Democrats had made huge gains in the 1874 congressional elections, mostly because of the resentment for Reconstruction in the North. And in the lame duck Congress, that last lame duck Congress, the radicals forced through a Civil Rights Act, which was the most sweeping legislation of its kind in the nation's history. That law provided that all persons within the jurisdiction of the United States shall be entitled to the full and equal enjoyment of the accommodations, advantages, facilities, and privileges of inns, public conveyances on land or water, theaters, and other places of public amusement, subject only to the conditions and limitations established by law and applicable alike to citizens of every race and color, regardless of any previous condition of servitude. Immediately, a hue and cry went up across the nation, all across the nation, on editorial pages, including the New York Times, by the way, which said in language eerily similar to what we hear today, that the law, the Civil Rights Act, has put us back in the art of governing men for more than 200 years. Startling proof how far and fast we are wandering from the principles of 1787, once so loudly extolled and so fondly cherished. The Civil Rights Act was denounced in speeches, by politicians, and even in churches. And where was the remedy seen to be? As today, with the health care law, in the courts. And also, just like the health care law, the editorial writers begged the Supreme Court to overturn the Civil Rights Act of 1875 in the name of liberty. In the meantime, however, the law stays on the books, at least theoretically. Theoretically, because although some businesses closed down, they reopened later, and others gave in, most businesses and most institutions simply ignored the law. Black Americans were denied seats in theaters and on public conveyances and were refused at restaurants in both North and South, and sometimes they were rejected violently. So as a result, a number of African American plaintiffs filed complaints and lawsuits to try to gain equal access. But the complaints were largely ignored because and the lawsuits languished. Prosecutors were not particularly willing to press a case where everyone thought the court would rule and they might be overturned, and they didn't want to do it anyway. And legal authorities were unwilling to take up the cause of African Americans and try to impose the rule on white business owners. The court, however, whom everyone assumed would take up this action relatively quickly, dragged its feet. They had any number of actions in which they could have used to test the law, but none made it to the calendar until 1883. Then the following year, 1876, after a tightly contested election between Rutherford B. Hayes, a Republican, and Samuel Tilden, a Democrat, a contest which historians almost universally agree Tilden won, the Electoral College went to Hayes by one vote, when 20 disputed electoral delegates, 19 from 3 states in the Deep South, were put in his column. Now, the full story of this event is wonderful and involves secret negotiations and backroom deals, and finally a commission, which was a 15-person commission, 7 Republicans in theory, and 7 Democrats, and 1 independent person to choose the president. The independent person was initially a Supreme Court Justice, David Davis, who everybody remarkably agreed was amazingly impartial. But the Democrats offered Davis a Senate seat, almost an assured Senate seat, and he took it. So to replace Davis, another Supreme Court Justice was chosen, a man named Joseph Philo Bradley, the only man in America's history to be empowered to choose a president by himself. And he chose Hayes. The reaction to that was so severe that there were widespread fears that a second civil war was imminent. In a compromise, the Democrats agreed to withdraw their objections to Hayes's election if Hayes agreed to pull the army out of the South, which he agreed to do. Now, the public was none too pleased with all of this chicanery, and Hayes became widely referred to, at least by Democrats, as Rutherford, or your fraudulency. Now, the justices, even though they avoid taking the Civil Rights Act head on, they began to chip away at the foundation of the law, which was the 14th Amendment. I don't have time to discuss all the cases, but I'll mention a few. In 1876, weeks after Hayes took office, the court issued a ruling in a very pivotal case called United States versus Cruikshank. Cruikshank stemmed from an incident on Easter Sunday, April 13th, 1873, when upwards of 250 armed white men, most on horseback, some dragging a 6-pound cannon, converged on the courthouse of Colfax, the seat of Grand Parish in central Louisiana, an inaccessible town. In and around the courthouse were approximately 150 armed black men awaiting the invasion behind barricades that they had thrown up and they had dug a ditch in front of. Many of the black men were duly appointed members of the Louisiana militia, and many of the white men were members of the Klan or other white terrorist groups. The confrontation had been precipitated by a gubernatorial election in which both the Republican, who was a carpetbagger, and the Democrat, who was a decorated Confederate Civil War veteran, had claimed victory. Each of them held a victory party, and there was such widespread fraud in the election that nobody could be sure at all who won. So the issue was sent to the courts, which was controlled by Republicans, and I suppose you can guess who was appointed governor. In any event, after the white men besieged the courthouse, whether they offered terms of surrender or to negotiate is unknown, although probably not. But once the shooting started, it was clear that the black men, the militia, was completely outgunned and outnumbered, so they gave up. After their weapons had been confiscated, the white invaders proceeded to slaughter their captives. As many as 100 black men were shot, stabbed, or drowned, some after they tried to run to the woods to safety. Afterwards, the whites claimed that the blacks opened fire first after the surrender, and a Captain Hadnot had been killed, but that seemed extremely unlikely since their weapons had already been taken from them before Captain Hadnot had been allegedly gunned down. So the affair had been dubbed either the Colfax Massacre or the Colfax Riot, depending on the political point of view of the speaker. And if nothing else, it reminded everybody what would happen if the army was pulled out of the South. Now, aware that Louisiana, even under a Republican governor, might not pursue this case with complete energy, the government moved to have the case removed to federal court. 100 of the invaders were tried, and 3 were convicted. They were not tried for murder, which was a state crime, but they were charged with, under the Enforcement Act of 1870, which applied criminal penalties to a wide range of activities in violation of the 14th Amendment. They were charged with depriving the black men of their constitutional right of free assembly. And there were significant Second Amendment implications in the case too, but we won't go into those. Now, the 3 men who were convicted, eventually appealed, and eventually the appeal reached the Supreme Court. The opinion in United States versus Cruikshank was written by Chief Justice Morrison Waite. Now, this was Waite's first major case. He had been President Grant's 3rd option after the death of Salmon P. Chase, who was the previous Chief Justice, and Waite was considered sufficiently a mediocrity that a wag quipped in The Nation, the magazine, that Waite was firmly in the first rank of second-rank lawyers. Now, in his opinion, Waite asserted, and by the way, Bradley, the same man who chose the president, had heard the case in circuit court, which will come in a bit. In his opinion, Waite asserted that the 14th Amendment prohibitions are limited and certainly does not extend the Bill of Rights, to the states, specifically in this case the right of assembly. And because the amendment reads, "Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction equal protection of the laws," the amendment applied only to state action and did not apply to private individuals who committed ordinary crimes. The ordinary crimes line he had taken from Bradley in the circuit court opinion. Regulating ordinary crimes was reserved to the state governments by the 10th Amendment, which reads, "The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people." Now, this conflict between the 10th Amendment, the States' Rights Amendment, and the 14th Amendment is key to the entire period. And the 10th Amendment and its scope and its limitations and its conflict with other amendments is also key to everything happening in the court today. According to Waite, because the 14th Amendment could not apply the Bill of Rights to the states, the Enforcement Acts, specifically in this case the Enforcement Act of 1870, had exceeded constitutional authority. Unless, of course, there was an exception. If the prosecutor could demonstrate that these crimes were racially motivated and meant to deprive a person of life, liberty, or property solely because of his or her race, the convictions might stand. But although upwards of 100 black men had been cold-bloodedly murdered by whites, and the whites had stated their intent, and excuse the language, but this is what they said, to evict the niggers, Waite saw no proof that race had anything to do with it. To him, it wasn't proven. This wasn't a racially motivated crime. So as a result, for one of the most heinous mass murders in this nation's history, not one single person spent one day in jail. In 1880, 4 years later, the court ruled on two equal protection cases involving access to juries. The first case, it's a very interesting case, involved the murder conviction of an African-American male named Taylor Strawder in West Virginia in April 1874. Strawder had killed his wife Anna in a fit of jealous rage, a fact he didn't deny. Moreover, he claimed to be justified in the act since Mrs. Strawder had been almost obsessively unfaithful, sleeping more or less openly with a multitude of other men, bringing shame and embarrassment upon her husband. Now, since it was a black woman, the local authorities evidently found Strawder's defense persuasive. They put him in jail, but 3 sessions of state circuit court passed before he went to trial. Only when his lawyers petitioned to have him removed was he brought to trial in state court, and he was convicted by an all-white jury and sentenced to hang. Strawder's lawyers appealed to the West Virginia Supreme Court. Their claim, incredibly, and all of you, anybody who does appellate work should listen to this, they included the assertion that their client had indeed been entitled to kill his wife. The only reason he was convicted, the lawyers maintained, was that West Virginia whites were so bigoted that a fair trial was impossible. As part of this latter point, the lawyers noted that by statute, only white men were eligible to be jurors. And this ran counter to Section 4 of the Civil Rights Act of 1875. So eventually, the appeal reached the United States Supreme Court, by which time, thankfully, it had been reduced to a question of statutory exclusion of African Americans from juries. The second case involved 2 teenaged African-American brothers in Virginia indicted for the murder of a white man in 1877. There would be no sympathy here. The jury chosen to try them in state court was again all white, but this time they were not chosen by statute, but they were chosen either by convenience or contrivance. But both juries were all white. Now, in Strawder, the cases came down one after another. Strawder came first. In Strawder, the court ruled that the defendant had indeed been discriminated against because of the statutory prohibition on black jurors. You cannot have in a statute that only white people can serve on the jury. In the Virginia case, however, the conviction was upheld. The Virginia law didn't specifically exclude African Americans, and although every contrivance might have been brought to bear to keep African Americans off juries, this had nothing to do with the court, and the brothers' 14th Amendment rights had therefore not been violated. So this sends a very clear, somewhat ludicrous message. All the white governments need do was not announce that they intended to discriminate, not put it in the statute. It doesn't matter what they did. As long as it wasn't on the paper, their 14th Amendment requirement rights would be met. Then in 1882, justices heard United States versus Harris, which is often referred to as a Ku Klux Klan case. A group of 20 men, one of them was a farmer named Harris, either broke in or were led into a jail where 4 black defendants were being held. They dragged the men out, they beat them so severely 4 of them died. Well, 1 of them died, excuse me. Harris and his 19 companions were charged under federal law for violating the Enforcement Act of 1871, which is often referred to as a Ku Klux Klan law, which forbade 2 or more persons from going in disguise upon the public highway to deprive any person or class of equal rights under the laws. So the roadmap is established. So Harris and his fellow defendants asked that the indictments be dismissed on the grounds that the federal government had no right to legislate the activities of private persons. If the state, that the 14th Amendment applied only to state action, not to individual action. The right to legislate against individual action was reserved to the states. And if the states chose not to pursue those who beat, burned, and murdered its fellow citizens, the federal government had no choice but to stand by and watch. Now, the case wasn't put in those terms, it was put in 10th Amendment terms, but that's what it amounted to. Again, the justices agreed, and Harris and his fellow Klansmen went free. Now, these decisions, by the way, were not rendered by the same 9 people, but an ever-changing roster of justices. Most of the presidents got to appoint either 2, sometimes 4, sometimes as many as 5 justices during their terms. Most of the appointments, which are numerous, did little to change either the makeup of the court or its philosophy, or change its direction, or frankly to provide it with much distinction. There were exceptions, however, and the most prominent occurred in 1877 when old Rutherford himself appointed a former Kentucky slaveholder named John Marshall Harlan to the Supreme Court. Harlan was a payback appointment. Kentucky had been widely expected to go to the Democrats, which since Hayes won by 1 vote, he would have lost the election. And Harlan, who was a slaveholder himself, who was the son of slaveholders, almost single-handedly moved around the state and brought the state in to Hayes, to his column. So clearly Hayes was grateful, and he put Harlan on the court. And with Harlan on the court, finally, in March 1883, the justices they heard arguments on 5 cases which would determine once and for all the constitutionality of the Civil Rights Act of 1875. Of the 5, interestingly, 1 was from New York, 1 was from California, and none were from the Deep South, which gives a sense of how widely ignored this law was. They had agreed to hear the cases in 1880, but didn't put them on the calendar until 1883. So during the delay, other African-American plaintiffs couldn't bring their cases to court because once circuit courts and district courts knew that the court would eventually hear test cases, they just essentially shut down. The decision in the civil rights cases, which is what they're called, was an anticlimax. After all the decisions that had come before, it was clear what the justices would do. And the vote was 8-1. And writing the opinion for the majority was Justice Joseph Bradley, who seemed to make a career of being at the right place at the right time. And Bradley ruled that Congress had indeed overstepped its mandate by attempting to regulate not just the action of states, but the actions of individual Americans. Now, the key portion of the decision was not the law part. That didn't surprise anybody. But what came after, when Bradley could not resist appending his own social views. He seemingly to scold people who would attempt to adjudicate equal rights, Bradley wrote, "When a man has emerged from slavery, and by the aid of beneficent legislation has shaken off the inseparable concomitants of that state," that's the way they wrote, There must be some stage in the progress of his elevation when he takes the rank of mere citizen and ceases to be a special favorite of the laws, when his rights as a citizen or a man are to be protected in the ordinary mode by which other men's rights are protected. In other words, he was saying, stop complaining. Now, this stunning myopia in a country where black Americans were regularly beaten, were regularly murdered, was challenged by only one man, and it was Justice Harlan, the former slaveholder. In his dissent, Harlan wrote, "I cannot resist the conclusion that the substance and spirit of the recent amendments of the Constitution have been sacrificed by a subtle and ingenious verbal criticism." Then Harlan quoted Edmund Plowden, who was a famed 16th century English legal theorist. And this is a phrase that all of us should remember. "It is not the words, but the internal sense that makes the law. The letter of the law is the body. The sense and reason is the soul." Then Harlan took on Bradley's stunning assertion about African American rights, the special favorites. "It is, I submit, scarcely just to say that the colored race has been the special favorite of the laws. What the nation, through Congress, has sought to accomplish in reference to that race is what had already been done in every state of the Union for the white race, to secure and protect rights belonging to them as free men and citizens, nothing more."